Welcome to the presentation on the Conscious Co-Creation Tools. The Conscious Co-Creation Tools are both tools and lenses for viewing organisation, and were inspired by the quote and the work of Dr. W. Edwards Deming, the father of quality management and systems thinking, who said, "Collaboration benefits those who choose to collaborate." And my question is therefore why and how? So the aims of this presentation are to underline the differences between highly effective and ineffective organisations, and the fact that long-term effectiveness is really not very tightly connected to money and resources. And in fact, it's complete inversions, not just differences, that define truly effective organisations. And we'll use these inversions to identify and lay down the foundations of a conscious co-creation model. And in the process, I hope that you find better questions, better analysis, better knowledge, and solutions, and above all, better ways of looking at organisation. One of the key principles that we're using here is to treat everything as a tool. What you're seeing is a mug. It doesn't hammer nails, it doesn't screw screws. It does its own job absolutely perfectly, but even then it can be abused because it doesn't hold liquids when it's held upside down. So we need to bring consciousness to organisation itself and to think about what works, how it works, and why it works. So the key topics we're going to cover include the failure of organisation and the evidence for that, and the reason why it's happening, and the fact that this is related to not just differences of operations, but completely inverted principles. And the solution is systems thinking, something that is well established and has proven itself over time, though many organisations are not necessarily applying it in the most effective manner. We'll give some examples of these organisations, and we'll use that to lay down the foundations upon which we'll build the conscious co-creative model. And then we're going to cover next steps, further exploration topics, including MOSO, the model of sustainable organisation, and other resources. So here's the evidence. John Hagel said the average life expectancy of a company in the S&P 500 has dropped from 75 years in 1937 to 15 years. And Ellen DeRoy says that the average life expectancy of companies in Europe is 12.5 years. And we should bear in mind that both of these said this about 15 years ago, and the situation has undoubtedly got worse since then. Before we move on, let's just pause and reflect upon this. The average life expectancy of a company in the S&P 500 has dropped from 75 years in 1937 to 15 years. And in 1937, those companies had to have gone through the First World War, the Wall Street crash, the Great Depression, and they didn't have the advantages of mobile phones, computers, modern telecommunications, instant data about customers, markets, modern logistics management, etc. So this is not all about resourcing. There's something much deeper at play here. Let's consider an organisation that is really an absolutely epic fail. This is just the first part of the structural diagram of this organisation, which is the organisational chart of the United Nations Environment Programme. Look at the complexity and the levels of management in that organisation. So here are our motives for paradigm change. Deming said the big problems are where people don't realise they have one in the first place. And he also said learning is not compulsory and neither is survival. So here are our causes. Putting money and profits before people, both within and outside an organisation. And that leads to short-termism. And that in turn leads to damaging the customers. And in fact, it's much more expensive and difficult to get customers back once you've got rid of them effectively. And a big issue underpinning all of this is a rear view mirror attitude to management, always using past figures for performance instead of thinking systemically and looking over the horizon and realizing that policies have consequences. Another big issue is hierarchy and command and control. And one of the key ones is changing and arbitrary targets. This month it's jobs. Next month it's costs. Next month it's taxation. Or in the corporate world, this month it's profits. Next month it's costs. And next month it's customer service. And these organisations also show a remarkable resistance to feedback and change, because people are telling them what the problem is, and they're just not listening, and they're not capable of responding. And this gives us an insight into what's happening underneath the whole thing, which is that these organisations are all about control, fear, and lack of collaboration. But above all, as Deming said, failure to manage a system as a system. So let's look at what systems thinking is first. But first of all, I think we should also go into the semantics, because some people have really deep resistance to words like organisation, structure, leadership, and systems. So what is a system? A system is simply something that behaves in a different way to its collection of individual parts. Deming said there's no point in cutting off a hand and studying it, because it doesn't work in the same way when it's placed upon a table than when it's attached to a person. So what we're seeing is a diagram of a very simple system where disturbances come in to impact the overall performance of the system. That leads to measurements. The measurements are then fed into a controller, and that can adjust the system. And this is the way the human body regulates its temperature, for example. So the human body is a system. Nature is a system. The earth is a system. The universe is a system, because everything is connected. So Deming went to the top 200 leaders of Japanese industry in the post-war period in about 1949-1950. And what he had to say so completely spellbound those senior executives that they absolutely went heart and soul into the Deming philosophy of systems thinking. And Deming was the son of a farmer, but he was also a statistician, and his trade was quality management, which he'd learned during the Second World War. And one of the things that Deming said was, if you don't know the capabilities of a system, there is no point in setting targets, because the system will deliver what the system will deliver. And he went on to say, and if you do know the capabilities of a system, there is still no point in setting targets, because the system will deliver what the system will deliver. And what he was really getting at was that the focus of management and leaders of an organisation should be on improving the system itself, rather than setting targets. So the fact is that organisational models and principles have a profound impact on long-term performance. And it's long-term performance that cuts out the successful organisations from the unsuccessful ones. So let's have a look at some examples of long-term commercial performance and the world of quality management. What we see first of all is John Lewis, and John Lewis is a partnership. It's been going for well over 100 years, but it was about 100 years ago that it was transferred into a partnership, effectively a trust, where all of the people in John Lewis owned the organisation. So John Lewis owns department stores and a well-known brand of supermarket in the UK called Waitrose. And the implication of what I'm talking about is that the people who sweep the floors, who stack the shelves, who man the tills, own the organisation. And someone had a bright idea, which wasn't a very bright idea, around about the year 1999 or 2000, which was, hey, we could sell John Lewis and we could all be rich. And the organisation, the people, decided that they didn't want that, despite the fact that the people who sweep the floors and stack the shelves could have made as much money as it would have cost them to buy a house in the UK at that time. And that's because they realised that their business would have been finished if that had happened. So they do enjoy some perks. They have their own special hotels and special breaks, things like that. They get a bonus at Christmas. But there is something very different about John Lewis and the way that it operates. However, having said that, personally, I have some concerns about the management regime that's been introduced in the last few years, and we'll see how that goes. Nevertheless, John Lewis is and has been an absolute exception that's lasted way longer than 15 years. Then we've got Gore, who produced Gore-Tex clothing, and Gore was set up as a kind of social experiment, where again the people own the business and effectively there's no management. They use self-organizing teams. And Gore is regularly one of the top employers in the United States, and it's been mega successful worldwide for way more than 15 years. Then we've got Toyota, one of the original 200 in Japan, founded by Soichiro Toyoda. And when you go into the Toyota factory, what you see is two pictures on the wall. One is a picture, naturally, of Soichiro Toyoda, but the bigger one, next to it, is the one of Dr. W. Edwards Deming. And one of the interesting attributes of Toyota is it's not just the world's biggest and most successful motor manufacturer, and has been for decades, but it also deposed Ford in the process. And it came out of nowhere because there was a very derogatory phrase applied to Japanese technology in Britain in the 1950s and the 1960s, which was Jap crap. And Toyota completely proved that that wasn't the case at all. They came out of nowhere, went to the top, and more importantly, they stayed at the top. Toyota has only 4 levels of management worldwide, despite having well over 200,000 employees as a multinational organisation. We can contrast that with the British civil service, which has over 300,000 employees and something like 12 or 14 levels of management. Which organisation do you think operates more efficiently and more effectively? It gets more interesting when we consider that what happened a few years ago was that they appointed a typical executive from the motor industry, I think from the United States, and Toyota rapidly began to have problems. Whereas previously their production lines would produce cars effectively to order. Whatever colour, whatever fittings you wanted came off the production line, and that required some very special quality management, and instead it became focused on costs and profits. And the result was that Toyota started to have problems, and that executive was sacked, and Toyota went back to the principles that had made it famous. Ford, in the meantime, in the 1970s, were producing cars which were, frankly, rubbish. Hundreds of thousands of them were coming out of the factory and coming straight in the back door because of known serious faults in multiple areas. And the result was that Ford began to hemorrhage cash, and it was deposed from its #1 position worldwide. And the result was some quite famous interviews and conversations between Deming and Ken Peterson, the chief executive of Ford at the time. And my view of those conversations is that they were quite revealing. And what they showed that was, although Peterson kind of understood what Deming was talking about, he didn't really understand it, fundamentally, at all. Nevertheless, Ford's performance started to improve. Peterson eventually retired, and so did Deming, and Ford started to decline in performance again, both in terms of quality, customer satisfaction, and ultimately finances. And then there was a return to the Deming principles, and guess what? Ford's fortunes recovered, and so did their quality and their performance. And finally, we've got the Mondragon Cooperative from Spain. Mondragon was founded by a Spanish priest in the 1950s as a local cooperative organisation producing at that time paraffin lamps, and it's now one of the top 10 manufacturers in Spain, producing things like solar panels with robotics. Again, it's an organisation owned by the members. So these organisations all have some interesting characteristics, which is they become good. They become very good, and they stayed good while they were sticking by the Deming principles of systems thinking and quality management. And in the cases where the organisation started to deviate away from them, they didn't do quite so good. One of the principles that we're aiming to employ in any organisation is the wisdom of the crowd, or the collective consciousness. And in fact, this should be differentiated from the madness of crowds. And there's a criteria for this, and there's a story. Sir Francis Galton was a famous British polymath and especially a statistician. And one day he went to a country fair. And in those days, around the 1900s, there wasn't television. And so these were consequently very, very big events. Literally hundreds of thousands of people went to British country fairs. And as a statistician, he was walking through the fair, and what he saw one day was a guess the weight of the ox competition. And he began to contemplate this as he walked through the throngs of people. And eventually he saw a big group of butchers, and he thought, the butchers will have a good idea about the weight of the ox. And then he saw a group of farmers, and he thought, the farmers will also have a good idea about the weight of the ox. But what Galton did was he averaged up everyone's guess. And his estimate came out at within 2 pounds of the weight of the ox. And even more importantly and interestingly, the nearest guess in each direction, including that of the many hundreds of farmers and butchers at the fair, came over 10 pounds away from the weight of the ox. And what Galton found was that large groups consistently make better decisions than a small group or an individual. And that depends on a series of criteria, because this has been analysed. It's not just about averaging. What you need is a population that is diverse, which gives it mathematical relevance and statistical validity. It also needs to be independent, which means it's not divided into political groups and lobby organisations. It also needs to be decentralised. And what that means is that the evidence and the views of the independent experts and the local knowledge is all harnessed equally. And what this means is that expertise can be applied, but in context. And it also needs to be structured. And in fact, what he found was that when you do this, you avoid mediocrity by averaging the errors out. And if we think about this in a political situation, what we find is, for example, let's take the British situation. So around about 50% of the people vote. But around about 50% of the people don't vote. And that makes them the biggest group overall. The people are alienated from the system. But in the meantime, you have the people who vote Conservative or Labour typically, and those in the middle, a smaller number who vote for other parties. And what you find is that most of them are actually voting negatively against the other group. So the people voting positively are a very small number. And if we go even deeper, what we find is that actually the number of people who are members of political parties in the UK is less than 1%. Nevertheless, this system runs the governance of the country. And do we avoid mediocrity? Do we average errors out? Or is the problem to do with the diversity, the lack of independence, the centralisation, and the strange way the system is structured? Now let's use a simple analogy to give us our lens for viewing organisation and to lay down the foundations for the conscious co-creation tools. The key 3 foundational elements are intention, structure, and process. Our ancestors have been sailing seas and oceans for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. How did they do it? Firstly, intention. They knew where they were going or what activity they were undertaking together, whether it was fishing or exploration or trading. They had an aligned intention. And everything in the world of physics and quantum physics comes from intention. Secondly, they had an appropriate structure to carry them there, a ship or a boat. And thirdly, they had a process which would allow for the actions of the wind and the waves along the way, because in all probability they'd never be on a perfect course from the time they left one port until they arrived at the next one. Let's consider now how most modern organizations work with respect to intention, which is constantly changing. tends to be more about short-term exhortations and slogans, back to the this month it's sales, next month it's costs, next month it's customer service. The structure is a pyramid, and that has its own byproducts. It's hierarchical, it's about command and control, but it's also highly political and highly divisive, and we'll go into that later. And the process is highly resistant to change, whether it's from within the organisation, from people spotting problems and wanting to improve them, or from outside, from the customers. The view is, we're perfect. What are you doing causing trouble? You're only a customer. If we apply that vision of intention, constantly changing, structure, divisive and hierarchical, and process, resistant to feedback, back to our ship, we'd be crashing into the harbour wall before we even left port. What we're looking at is not just differences, but inversions in the way that those things should be operating in an organisation. So let's now look at the basic elements of a systems thinking organisation. Well, we've covered intention, structure and process, and how important it is to get those right. But the next thing we add on is vision, which is, what's our target? What are the things that are most important to us, and what do they look like in an ideal world? So if we're talking about a community, for example, we could be talking about the food, the water, the waste, the energy, the healthcare, the building materials, the social facilities, the shops, the schools, and things like that. So what's important to us, and what does it look like in an ideal world when we get there? Because if we don't have the vision, we're never going to get there. And we might as well aim high, but we need to have clarity on where we're going as well. And if we know where we are and we know where we're going, now we can create a strategy. A strategy is how we win the game. A plan is the detailed steps that lead us from where we are now to where we want to get to. And it gives us an opportunity to think about what comes first. So when we're building a house, for example, we might want to start off with a plan, and then planning permission, and then the groundworks, the ordering of the materials, etc. There has to be a distinct running order. And thinking about that is very important, so we can make sure it does happen in the right order. And finally, we need to bring consciousness into the organisation itself in the form of feedback. And in this case, what we're talking about is not just planning things and doing things, but reflecting upon the process of the planning and the doing, and the process of the process, which is how we decided things, how we organise things. So if we plan, we do, and reflect, then the final thing that we need to do is to act upon that information. And we should be doing that like a little spinning wheel all the time. Plan, do, reflect, act. Plan, do, reflect, act. And if we do, we can build in the lessons to the organisation and feed it directly into the culture. Another insight into organisation is the words of Lao Tzu, who said, "Be still as a mountain and flow like a great river." And now let's reflect on how that applies to intention. The intention should be still. It should be like our guiding star of our ship. But if it's constantly moving, we're never going to get there. And what about the process? It should be flowing. It should be based on feedback. But in most organisations, it's completely stuck. It's like concrete. It's still. So we have a complete inversion of those principles in most organisations. They're as still as a river and flowing like a mountain instead. Let's look at the community as an example, and we'll take the intention here as being the all-embracing intention first of all. So, this needs to be simple, straightforward, on point. The intention here is to create an empowered community where individual creativity and sovereignty is embraced and valued and based upon shared ownership and shared values, where we work wisely using proven safe technologies for our key needs, and where we create not just sustainability but abundance, more than we need, so we can flip costs to income. And in the process, we can cover our requirements for not just quantity, but quality of food, water, waste, buildings, energy, and health essentials in an exemplary way for the benefit of people and planet. Let's go into structure now, because Schwartz said structure is everything, and he was right. And there is a prevailing view among many people that nature is not structured at all. They look out and they see randomness. And it's only a few people in all the elements of the universe who believe that things aren't structured and shouldn't be structured. But look at this. Here's the evidence. Body length versus body mass of unicellular algae. What you're seeing is a very tight correlation between mass and body length. And that's because everything in the universe is built on the conservation of energy principle. Here we're seeing body length versus body mass and the radius of the aorta versus body weight for a mouse, a rat, a guinea pig, a rabbit, a dog, a bigger dog, a sheep, a man, a horse, an ox. And the same scaling applies to tree trunks. We've got a linear correlation because everything in the universe is about conservation of energy. And here is the lifespan versus body mass of birds, mammals, and invertebrates. And here's the metabolic rate, which sets the pace of life, as small animals live fast and die young. A mouse, a rat, a guinea pig, a rabbit, a dog, a hare, another dog, a sheep, a human being, an ox, and a horse. So the universe is incredibly highly structured. And structure is everything. So we need an appropriate structure for our organisation as well. And if we get such things confused, we end up with some really weird results, because the telephone box doesn't work so well as a camper van, and neither of them will substitute for a rubber duck. This is our typical organisational structure, which everyone will recognise: hierarchical, pyramidal, divisive. So the pyramidal structure attracts the people most interested in power to the top, and then they become surrounded by people who are also most interested in power, and that's how you end up with politics, ego, and control deeply embedded in an organisation, because those people want to get to the top, and they start internally competing with each other. And that means sales doesn't care about their impact on marketing, because hey, if that makes marketing look bad and sales look good, they don't mind transferring the costs. How many times have we seen this within organisations? And then those people become very concerned about their empire. They don't want to hear the bad news that makes their department look bad. That makes you a troublemaker. So keep your mouth shut and don't say anything, even though it's an opportunity to improve the organisation. And God forbid if you're a customer and you've got a problem because our organisation is perfect. And that means we'll even take legal action against you when we've actually caused the problem. And I've seen that. So these are inherent problems with pyramidal structures, and they're common. And that's because structure has a huge impact. It produces outcomes which are natural byproducts of the pyramidal structure: politics, control, hierarchy, bureaucracy, disempowerment of the people at the floor. If you're in the UK, you may remember an old television series featuring Sir John Harvey-Jones, which was called Back to the Floor, and he did the most extraordinary thing. Except it wasn't extraordinary, it was completely common sense. The first thing he did when he was visiting an organisation as a consultant was to walk through the shop floor. And then you got the embarrassment of the board when he said, "When was the last time you walked through the factory floor?" And they went, "What?" But it's the people at the bottom in the factory. It's the people who interface with the customers who really know what's going on. How can you have any impact on that or knowledge of it if you're so divorced from that situation, stuck in your ivory tower with your leather chairs and your £1,000,000 pay packet? We need to think about structure in two ways. The first one is a corpus, and we have specialist functions associated with different corpuses. Trusts used to be known for privacy, but actually they're still known for asset protection, and not so much for privacy nowadays due to Know Your Client and anti-money laundering legislation worldwide. And then you've got limited liability companies, which are, of course, all about money. And then you've got cooperatives, which are about cooperation. And you've got foundations, which are also quite similar to trusts, but more statutized. And then you've got charities, which are barely charitable in most cases. They're normally about fat cat executives taking ludicrous salaries, and in the case of the biggest charities, typically actually getting 2, 3, 5% to the actual people on the ground for whom the money is being raised. So highly regulated, highly bureaucratic, and very, very corrupt. We need to think about corpuses in a more sophisticated way anyway, because what we should be thinking about is the particular attributes of these organizations and whether they should be standalone, or whether we can employ, for example, the power of asset protection of a trust in a community situation with the leverage of a cooperative to share operations. And in that case, what we can do is we can have organizations not standalone but connected together like organs of the body. So, for example, in a community, a trust could hold the land and the property, a cooperative could do the operations, and on that basis, if there is some kind of an economic shock, then the cooperative simply folds and the people start another one, in the same way as big business operates. And what that means is they don't lose their land or their property, but they can still have an effective organization for actually doing business operations. We also need to consider the human structure features, and ideally we need to be creating the kind of things that have supported those organizations that we covered before, the ones that have super longevity, a sense of mutuality, co-ownership, empowerment at the lower levels of the organization, ideally a flat structure, leading to involvement and stability, but at the same time opening up innovation, because that's exactly how nature works. Nature is always in balance. It's in homeostasis, which is a state of biological stability, but dynamic equilibrium. It's constantly evolving at the same time. And we need to employ the collective consciousness. So if this looks impossible, it's not. It's simple. It's circles, of course. So imagine this is our community, and what we have now is a small group of servant leaders in the middle who are drawn to the task of planning, organizing, creating strategy. Well, if they're the ones who decide, we've just created another pyramid, haven't we? But instead, if their act is genuine service, then what they will be doing is doing that work for the others and making recommendations based on considered opinions and feeding that out to the bigger group for the bigger group, to then ask questions, make suggestions, and ultimately take the decisions. And if we've done that, we've just flattened out the hierarchy, and we've also created an interesting energetic flow, which is this, a toroid, and that's the very basis of energetic flow in the whole universe. Do you want me to prove it? We will get there. And if we want to scale and add complexity to an organization like this, we can have other teams, circles, surrounding the strategy team. So in the case of our community, we could have people dealing with food, water, waste, energy, healthcare, building materials, education, etc. But if each one is a circle and each one appoints a chair and the chair represents them on the strategy team, then we have a direct connection between those groups and the strategy and vice versa. And everything is kept beautifully aligned and together. And of course, what we're creating is the flower of life. And if this all looks very highfalutin and not very grounded, let's get to the physics. Because this is the first image of the atomic structure of hydrogen. What do you see in terms of the energy flow? It's a toroid. and these are the individual atomic bonds inside a molecule, all based on the conservation of energy principle. So now we need to consider processes, which is how we apply the collective consciousness. And what we're recommending is 3 types of circles. The energy circle, which is made for fast decision making, where those with the experience, the ideas, the intuition, the inspiration focus on solutions to problems, and then on improving the solutions that are already on the table. So, I don't like it, doesn't fly, because it can't fly. It's a political, ego-based blocking mechanism at worst, and at best it just undermines the flow of the people putting in the work. So unless people can put forward a better idea, it's not actionable. And that's the role of the group and the chair to say, sorry, that doesn't work. So if that's for fast flow, and we need that because so many conscious eco-spiritual organizations have had debates and arguments for decades about the color of the carpet or the front door, that we need to get well and truly past that. Otherwise, that absolutely drags the energy out of an organization. But when that does happen, we need a deeper, slower, more reflective process to unearth the positions of all the people, and that is a listening circle. And that's a much more structured exercise, where it goes round at least 3 times and people talk without any interruption, and everyone else's job is to listen until you come out with clarity, understanding, re-establishment of trust, appreciation of different people's positions, and if necessary, a decision. And the final recommendation is an action learning circle, which comes straight out of physics from the Rutherford laboratory. And this is kind of a cross between an energy circle and a listening circle, where actually everyone acts as everyone else's mentors. They work as a group to work on a particular project or on individual projects. And when they're effectively coaching each other, they do it by primarily asking questions and telling stories, but not by saying, if I was you, I'd do it this way. And that's aimed to produce the performance of the individual and to take that to a new level, but also the group itself. And then ideally we need some principles which we can agree as well, because this is about team agreements. So can you agree to the Toltec principles? Be impeccable with your word. Don't take anything personally. Don't make assumptions. Always do your best. And by all means be skeptical, but learn to listen. So these are things that can't be measured. But it's what we primarily apply to ourselves, first of all. But then we also set a standard for the whole organisation. And we need to hold ourselves and each other to account for this. Because if we get people who habitually overpromise because they have a lack of structure in their lives, then ultimately it means that they end up being unreliable. And that undermines trust. And that is a problem on an individual relationship basis, but also it impacts the team field itself. And we need to somehow get ways of people being able to learn about this and to go, yeah, I can see that. I'm going to try not to do that again. And if they really are open to learning, then they say, yeah, pull me up on that. Let me know. But I'm now seeing the impact of what I do unconsciously. Let's look at the other team agreements. This is a really important one, which is take responsibility for yourself, for your actions, for your emotions, and for dealing with team issues. And that's because a process only works if it, the team, and the team intention are supported. And we can't have the situation where one person sticks their head above the parapet and gets it shot off because no one else is taking responsibility. So we need to appreciate that we all need to take responsibility. And the recommendation is also for team decisions, but not consensus. And that doesn't mean we need to be overly rigid, because we can try more than one option. If we're building a community, it doesn't mean everyone has to build a straw bale house or a dome. Why not build both? The question then is, which one are we going to build first before we create the feedback process built on this? But why not consensus? Well, the problem is too many people are too caught up in their programs, and politics and ego means that people who are off balance can hold a whole organization hostage effectively, and it happens. And when we go deeper into, okay, but tribes use consensus, what we find is that, yeah, to an extent, what we really find is that actually deeply traditional, culturally interwoven, long-lasting organizations do tend to use a model of consensus, and they tend to be religious groups and tribes. However, there are also limits to that, because a tribe is not going to be bent around the issues of someone who's got problems of alcohol, drugs, or mental illness. That doesn't fly. So there are always limits to consensus as well. And we also need to be able to deal with conflict. And we need to also do some learning with regards to the juxtapositions between agreeableness and honesty. And there's a fine line between being honest and using that as a stick to beat people and to project and to judge and to use harsh words and to wound. So ideally we also learn some of the principles of non-violent communication, and that means speaking from the I. When I see this, I perceive that, I feel this, etc. So we need to be able to tread a fine line between really very honest and open communication versus projection. And this is the difference between self-reflection and self-mastery versus command and control. But what it also means is that when there's someone that we know well who's saying, no, this is wrong, this doesn't fit well with me, then we listen to them and we respect that. So we're also acquiring ways to deal with conflicts in values, because ultimately we have our own conflicts in values. And that's the biggest one to deal with, which is things like agreeableness versus honesty versus what about the group? What about the group intention? I'm very passionate about how people feel. Well, is that to come before the group intention? These conflicts arise within the group and within each individual as well. And if we deal with them in the right way, then we come to a point of clarity. So what I'm suggesting here is self-organizing teams effectively, based on a few simple processes, rules, structures, etc. And that in this way we can easily grow and extend an organization and actually develop a culture based upon this. But what we need to understand is the absolute crucial importance of how we look at organization and how we apply these tools and these insights. And ideally we want the simplest possible iteration to begin with, but to also understand that if the people decide that's not working, that it can be developed by the people as well. So it's not a straitjacket, but back to the mug, back to the tools. We need to bring a great deal of consciousness and discernment into what does it do, how does it work, and how and why should we change it, and with what intention. So there's also a proposition of some key service roles, which is a circle chair who's a servant leader. They're there actually to serve the group, and especially to keep the focus of the group upon the intention of the group, and to support the group energy and the flow. And part of their role is to ensure everyone gets heard, and when the group is divided, to propose bridging solutions. But also they need to identify when issues are arising and bring those issues to the table in a neutral, straightforward and fearless manner, which means those things are dealt with as soon as they're seen and recognized properly, so that they don't grow and fester. And that means the group has to apply the processes, and it does it fast. And sometimes it's necessary to drag through a lengthy process of a listening circle, for example, so that we do get that clarity and understanding coming out, and we see the importance of what we do and what we don't do in terms of supporting the group, its intention and its processes. Another great role is that of the administrator, someone who picks up the task of administration, briefing, preparing, recording, noting, summarizing, etc. Because if we're making decisions, they need to be communicated and they need to be clear, and they shouldn't rely on a group of people's memories, because after a while those memories are liable to change. We all run on our programs and processes to a certain extent, and it's the easiest thing in the world for something to drop through the gaps. The main thing is to identify when something has dropped through the gaps and then bring it back to the group for sorting out. So this is a really important role in terms of not just bringing structure but bringing flow to an organisation. It's a really key service role. Another really useful one is the counsellor or mediator, who can assist as needed. And they help individuals with their programs, they help people who are having some conflict issues or misunderstandings, and ideally they're both gifted and trained in non-judgmental listening. And they can support and assist the individuals involved in conflicts and misunderstanding. So they should be suitably trained and experienced, such as with imago counselling, and ideally what happens is that the people involved deal with things themselves first of all, and if not, then the counsellor comes in to help and support to deal with things before they go to the group level, because whenever the group gets involved it's more time and more effort from them, even though actually it's a valuable learning experience for everybody. So what about the values of the organisation? Well, how about trust? What does trust mean? It means that we don't overpromise. It means that people can count on me or us. It means I will put it in my diary. I will get back to you. And if I say I'm going to introduce you to someone, I'll actually go out of my way to make sure that that happens quickly. And I should know that you should never have to ask me twice, or 3 times, or 4 times, or 5 times, because by that time I'm losing trust in you and the relationship is becoming damaged. At the same time, we should be open to learning, because none of us is perfect. And we need to address that juxtaposition of transparency or honesty versus agreeableness, which is pointed out by the 5 aspects psychometric test. What an interesting juxtaposition that is, if you've never considered it before. And what about sharing success equally? Because everyone has gifts to bring to an organisation. How about this for an example? You've got someone who's an absolute world-class genius like Einstein. They're so much the nutty professor, though, that they're always wearing different socks, and they keep forgetting to drink water or have a cup of tea during the day, and they're just buried in their work all day long. I had an uncle who had Down syndrome. He could tie his shoes, he could do other basic tasks, and you couldn't hope for a nicer human being. What if those two were paired up? What is the value now of the person with Down syndrome if they can keep an eye and look after the nutty professor and take them a cup of tea, make them a sandwich, make sure they eat, make sure they're hydrated, and free up their time from having to do those jobs themselves? What is the value of the time that's been freed up by the person who's got Down syndrome, for example, or some other disability? Think about that contribution, because more lives are saved by refuse men than they are by surgeons. So we should be sharing the success equally and honouring and valuing each other's gifts. And that means we should have respect for each other and others in general, and the environment. And we should understand that Deming said another very profound thing, which is examples without theory invite mindless copying. And that's exactly what happens in most organisations. There's no theory, but theory underpins everything in science. Without theory, we just have a collection of data or random facts. Theory makes sense of that. So we need to have a theory, we need to test it, and we need to get far away from mindless copying of organisational structures and processes. And if we can do that, we can act consciously, systematically, and with intent. and in a way that we can build in constant improvement. So the vision items should be the key performance indicators for an organisation. This is business speak for what's important to us. And those important items should form the ideal world targets of what does it look like in an ideal world when we get there. And now we know what we're aiming at, we can communicate it and we can share it, so it needs to be on paper. And that means the key items are defined and grounded. They shouldn't be poetry necessarily, but it's nice if you can have some poetic bullet points, for example, that are very clear and very grounded. So our vision items for our community could be the things we mentioned earlier: the food, the water, the waste, the energy, the healthcare, the building materials, social facilities, education, etc. And what about an overarching vision statement, which is that our measure of success is to change the model on a long-term basis, which is paradigm change, to inspire others and to help them to do it for themselves. So there's a sub-theme of empowerment here, empowering of other people. And what about doing it by creating a fractal that can self-govern and self-evolve and join together on a level playing field of common values with other similar organisations? And like nature itself, be in homeostasis, it retains balance while constantly evolving. So we've already mentioned how we harness the collective consciousness through this spinning wheel of constantly planning, doing, reflecting and acting. And the aim is to actively generate feedback, which is opportunities for development and learning, and to also view mistakes as opportunities for continual improvement if we recognise the gift potential. The tendency in many organisations and many situations is to sweep things under the carpet, and we need to have a culture of sweeping things out from under the carpet so that they get dealt with. So the collective consciousness can be both tangible and measurable, but it can also be human and intangible, which is about opinions, perceptions, intuition. And that can be gauged from both inside and outside the organisation for suppliers and other people, customers, etc. But it should also be regular and scheduled, and it should become a habit to identify the areas for constant improvement and innovation, and so should the listening circle. It really should be happening on a regular basis, because if not, then the person who looks at the conscious co-creation tools and goes, "Oh, that's great, I'd absolutely love to do that." The next thing is they find they're having a listening circle about something that they have been doing or they haven't been doing, and now it becomes a crisis. So if it's a regular thing, the intimidation factor is taken out, but it's the opportunity to take the stuff out from under the carpet and have it dealt with before it becomes magnified. And it should be for both self and collective reflection. If we want to go further, then you can look at the model of sustainable organisation, which is effectively a free, voluntary how-to of creating a sustainable organisation. And it is also an explanation of how to do the international standard for organisational sustainability, which I think was 9008-2009, ISO 9008-2009. So MOSO has deeper insights into other things, because this is just the start. If we're going to do things like aquaponics, then we should know about things like statistical process control, which is, when is the system stable? What are the boundaries of the fluctuations of the flows of a stable system? Because if you don't understand that, it's the equivalent of the boss coming in before Christmas and sacking his sales force for the Christmas card sellers, when they know that they go out selling their Christmas cards in January, February, March, April and May, and not immediately before Christmas, because all the orders have been for months. And it's the equivalent on the other side of him standing on his desk and cheering when they've just done their ordinary job and been selling cards hand over fist in the early parts of the year, so that they fit the schedule for later on in the year. So what I'm getting at is, if we don't know when a system is stable and we don't know the boundaries of a system, then we don't know when the system is getting outside those boundaries, and that is our signal for investigation and for remedial action. Because if not, we end up tampering and interfering when we're seeing just the normal flows and fluctuations of an organization or a system. So some of this stuff is really absolute gold to go into if you're running processes and systems, but it's also a deeper look at organization as well. It's both a set of tools and it's a lens. So there are free resources I can direct you to, including the official book, the official digest, my unofficial notes, the YouTube introductory video, and you could also just Google Dr. W. Edwards Deming and systems thinking. So let's summarize. Organization is failing, and it's endemic, and it's down to common factors, and it's down to lack of knowledge. It's down to poor management that don't know their jobs. It's down to mindless copying, and it's down ultimately to not just incorrect application of organizational principles, but complete inversions, misunderstanding that things need to be as still as a mountain and flow like a great river. The solution is systems thinking. It's thinking systemically, and it's proven in many situations. But it's not widely known, and it's both the examples and the exceptions that prove the rule. And if we understand this, we can lay down the foundations of a successful, conscious, co-creative organization. We can address the inversions, we can get the very basics right, and if we do that, then we can evolve. And along the way, we can empower a team and collaborate. Another great systems thinker, but someone who had really very little to say about organization, unfortunately, was Buckminster Fuller. But he was another great inspirational character, and so was Deming. Deming was awesome and deserves to be much better known. But Bucky Fuller said you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. If you have any questions, please put them underneath the video or send them to me directly. I'll get back and answer all of them, if necessary by making another video. And if you're interested in using them, my suggestion is start off by creating a nice, simple, all-encompassing intention, which you can decide on as a group. Then make a shortened version of the Conscious Co-Creation Tools paper and dedicate it to your group. Get everyone to accept it or put in recommendations and make team decisions. Use it as a starting point, modify them if necessary as you go along. And finally, if you're having some kind of a meditation at the start of any of your meetings, my suggestion is to use the intention as the focus point for all of your meetings, so you don't get people drifting away from the what's it all about and why am I involved, which is amazingly common. Thank you for watching.